Every 100 minutes, a football field-sized strip of land in Louisiana vanishes forever into the ocean. Not tomorrow, not in a storm. Right now, the erasure is relentless. Nearly 2,000 square miles of land, an area as vast as an entire state, have been wiped off the map since the 1930s. The media constantly bombards us with the idea that this is simply the inevitable consequence of rising sea levels. We believe that nature is ruthlessly attacking humanity. But the truth behind it is a man-made catastrophe. The river that once gave birth to Louisiana is being held captive. This delta isn't disappearing because of erosion by the sea. It's starving to death. And the main culprit is the massive concrete system that humans built with the illusion that they could shackle nature. You might think you're sitting thousands of miles from this coast, and the disappearance of a swamp has nothing to do with your life. But look closely at the interconnectedness of this system. That collapsing strip of land is the only natural shield protecting 20% of America's energy supply and vital shipping lanes. When that shield crumbles, the next storm won't just sweep away coastal homes. It will hit your gas tank, your electricity bill, and your family's daily meals. There were desperate cries for help. A multi-billion-dollar mega project was promised by the government to restore nature. But as you watch this video, that rescue project has quietly been abandoned, leaving millions to face the ocean's death sentence. In this video, we will expose the blindness of the entire system and reveal the haunting truth about an island that was once paradise. Now the bloodiest evidence of a future from which you cannot escape. To understand the devastating scale of this collapse, we don't need to look at computer models predicting the future. We only need to look at Isle de Jean-Charles. This isn't a story about what could happen to the Louisiana coast. This is bloody evidence of what actually happened. Deep within the Terrebonne parish, this narrow strip of land was once a world apart, a peaceful haven surrounded by a network of canals and a rich wetland ecosystem. At its peak, this vast land, spanning over 22,000 acres, was home to a community of hundreds of people with a long-standing Native American heritage. They lived here for generations, relying entirely on the water's rhythm for fishing and building a culture unlike anywhere else. But nature, under the impact of massive man-made machines, began to reclaim its territory. Today, that 22,000-acre land is reduced to a mere 320-acre, barely surviving fragment. Only a dozen or so families stubbornly remain. The roads that once led them home have vanished beneath the water's surface, even during normal high tides. Salinity intrusion is suffocating the ecosystem. The gray, dead tree stumps along the water's edge are natural tombstones heralding its end. The islanders had been sounding the alarm for decades. They pointed out the rising sea level to officials, pleading for a solution. But like any systemic disaster, the warnings always came long before the undeniable crisis. And government action always came too late, when the damage was irreparable. It wasn't until 2016, when much of the island had been wiped out, that the system officially acknowledged its failure by granting the first federal resettlement grant in history. They forced the residents to relocate north. The media quickly bestowed upon them the haunting title, America's First Climate Refugees. But for them, this relocation was more than just the loss of property. As the island sank, it took with it entire memories, ancestral cemeteries, and the identity of a community. The disappearance of Isle de Jean-Charles is not an isolated event. It is a prophecy for the fate of the entire infrastructure system along the Gulf of Mexico. But why could such a vast, stable landmass crumble from within so quickly? The truth is, the sea didn't swallow Louisiana on its own. The land is dying because it has been deprived of its only source of life. To understand why this coastline is being wiped out, we must go back in time to witness how America's greatest river created it. Long before megacities, highways, or massive concrete walls appeared, the Mississippi River did something extraordinary. It didn't just flow through Louisiana, it built the entire state of Louisiana. For thousands of years, the river operated in an unbreakable natural cycle, flooding, receding, and sediment deposition. Each spring, the river carried millions of tons of fertile silt from the center of the North American continent, overflowing its natural banks and pouring into the depressions. Layer upon layer, year after year, that endless cycle built up swamps, barrier islands, and created the solid foundation for millions of future lives. Overflowing, depositing, building, repeating. It was nature's most perfect machine of geological creation, but humans with their superior egos rarely accept the fury of nature. Historical floods that devastated crops, submerged towns, and claimed countless lives forced the U.S. government to declare war on the river. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers intervened. They built one of the greatest systems of dikes and flood barriers in human history. And we must admit, this system worked precisely to the millimeter, exactly as designed. It chained the river. Floods ceased. Commerce and industrialized agriculture boomed in a false sense of security. These concrete walls saved millions of lives. But no one tells you the dark side of this contract. When humans confined the river in a concrete pipe, they inadvertently imprisoned millions of tons of sediment within it. The enormous source of sediment that once served to build up the swamps is now being swept straight into the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico, where it becomes completely useless. Remember this cruel law of geology. A delta cannot survive on memories. It needs sediment. The walls saved people but starved the entire coastline. The lack of sediment has completely severed nature's self-healing mechanism. But the loss of sediment is only half the death sentence. Because right now, the land beneath the feet of Louisianans is not only being eroded by the waves, but it is also being sucked down into hell from below. The media tells you that sea levels are rising. But what they're hiding is, the earth in this area is actively sinking to allow the waves to penetrate deeper. Humans have gutted this land with drills thousands of meters deep, creating a giant hole underground. And when a sinking swamp meets rising sea levels, a self-accelerating cycle of destruction is triggered. The next storm won't just hit the shore, it will go straight into your bedroom. The crisis of sediment loss is only the surface of the disaster. Beneath the surface, this coastline is digging its own grave. Louisiana isn't just being gnawed away by the ocean from the outside, it's facing a deadly phenomenon called double pressure. By the laws of physics, layers of organic-rich soil are constantly being compressed over time. When sediment from rivers is blocked, this subsidence occurs without any new material filling the void. But more cruelly, humanity's thirst for energy has become an accelerating engine for destruction. Decades of oil and gas extraction and the depletion of groundwater have stripped away the underlying support structure. Without support, millions of tons of surface rock are compressing and collapsing. In hotspots, the ground is sinking at a rate of 3 centimeters per year. The concept of sea level rise is now infinitely more devastating. Because for Louisiana, the ocean doesn't need to rise on its own. The land itself is actively sinking into the depths to receive the waves. When the land sinks and the swamps drown, it triggers the most ruthless, self-accelerating loop of the climate system. Swamps are not useless puddles of mud. In science, they are natural infrastructure giant sponges that absorb the energy of storm surges and weaken the power of storms. As the swamps shrink, the protective shield is punctured. Storm surges immediately penetrate further inland. Saltwater intrusion sweeps through, poisoning and killing vast amounts of freshwater vegetation. The root systems, which once acted as a steel mesh holding the ground together, now rot. The mud, lacking anchorage, instantly disintegrates and is permanently submerged by the waves. As the water expands, the shield continues to thin, paving the way for the next storm to push the destruction miles further inland. This disaster feeds itself. The more land is lost, the more erosion occurs at an irreversible rate. This devilish cycle wasn't just theoretical. Isle de Jean-Charles lived and died within that very cycle. Faced with inevitable annihilation, the engineering elite at Baton Rouge devised the greatest and most insane gamble in American history: physical intervention to force the Mississippi River back to life. A multi-billion-dollar project called sediment diversion was born. They intended to breach the levee system and dump sediment back into the dying swamp. But nature never gives anything for free. In the following section, we will uncover the truth about this historic project and witness a brutal moral tragedy. Saving the land would mean destroying the livelihoods of thousands of people before all hope was officially crushed by the system. The disappearance of Isle de Jean-Charles didn't happen overnight. Its inhabitants had foreseen this catastrophe decades earlier. They pleaded for help. They led officials along the coast, desperately pointing to the rising tide marks. But the system always operates like a ruthless bureaucracy. Warnings always come long before the crisis becomes undeniable. And rescue efforts always, without exception, come too late, when the damage is irreversible. By the time the U.S. government officially acknowledged Isle de Jean-Charles as an unsalvageable community, much of the island had already been swallowed by the ocean. As the landmass sank, it took away not just property. It completely erased their identities, their culture, and the cemeteries where their ancestors rested. A world wiped out simply because the system refused to listen. Cornered by the devastating rate of erosion, engineers at CPRA headquarters in Baton Rouge have devised a crazy plan, unprecedented globally. They call it silt diversion. The core idea is to breach the concrete levee system, building giant gates to redirect the Mississippi River's water and silt back to replenish the starving wetlands. Essentially, they are trying to restart the natural geological engine that humans themselves crippled centuries ago. The Mississippi River has already built this land once in history. The question is, can supercomputers and reinforced concrete convince it to rebuild again? But here's the harsh truth the system refuses to face. Any attempt to save the Louisiana coast requires someone to sacrifice something irreplaceable. The fatal problem here is salinity. Opening the gates to release billions of gallons of fresh water into Barataria Bay would mean a complete alteration of the ecosystem. For oysters unable to move away from the coral reefs, this change in salinity is a death sentence. To save the land, the government would have to strip thousands of fishing families of their livelihoods and destroy their assets, a path to survival that has lasted for generations. There is no perfect solution, and then the system collapsed under its own weight. Instead of a courageous decision, politicians chose paralysis. After years of being drained by factional lawsuits and budget overruns, the historic multi-billion-dollar sediment diversion project was officially abandoned by the state government. The final technological gamble has failed. The blindness and cowardice of the institutions have hammered the final nail into Louisiana's coffin. You might think this failure is merely the tragedy of Gulf fishermen or of isolated small islands. But beware of your illusion of security, because this coastline being wiped out is actually a national emergency disguised as a local disaster. When the last swamp shield crumbles, America will pay a price no supercomputer would dare publicly predict. For a long time, the media and policymakers viewed this coastline as a natural landscape, a purely environmental conservation issue. They were fatally wrong. The swamps are not a landscape, they are a protection. Hidden behind this crumbling swamp shield are seaports, shipping lanes, and an infrastructure system that carries much of the entire United States energy supply. As that shield shrinks every 100 minutes, the ocean will move deeper. The risk is no longer a few homes being flooded. A storm striking this vulnerable point without the swamps to hold it back will immediately trigger a nationwide supply chain disruption. The power grid will collapse. Refineries will be paralyzed. Every American's bill will skyrocket. This is not just a Louisiana crisis. This is a national emergency disguised as a local disaster. And even more devastating, this catastrophe isn't confined to the borders of the United States. It's unfolding on a planetary scale. Louisiana is essentially a giant real-life laboratory because its collapse has preceded the curvature of the world by decades. All the greatest deltas on Earth, from the Nile and Ganges to the Mekong River system, are facing the same pattern of destruction. Megadams upstream have cut off the flow of sediment, groundwater extraction is causing land subsidence, and rising sea levels are acting as the final blow. The lesson here is an unchangeable law of physics. Any delta that depends on sediment for its survival but is deprived of the river that carries it is bound to be wiped out. The warning system has been sounding for a long time, but the biggest flaw of modern civilization isn't the lack of data, but the paralysis of the system. Politicians and engineers are desperately trying to accomplish in a few years what should have taken generations. And this is the cruelest pattern of any systemic crisis. Warnings always come long before disaster becomes undeniable. And rescue action is only approved long after the damage is irreversible. With the impetus of climate change, our time is not just running out. In some places, that door has officially slammed shut. Nearly 2,000 square miles of territory have vanished from the map. Communities that once existed there have disintegrated. The land has become the open gulf and will never return in our lifetime. When these communities left, they weren't simply moving house. When the land disappeared, it took with it memories, ancestral cemeteries, cultural identity, and an entire world that once existed. So the final question for supercomputers is no longer whether Louisiana can recover what it has lost. The answer is already set. It cannot. The only question remaining is, can this system prevent the coast from losing everything that remains? The fall of Louisiana leaves humanity with one final devastating choice. Act early at a high cost and with uncertain outcomes, or act too late at a catastrophic price when all options have been exhausted. The Mississippi River took thousands of years to build this land, but now, a piece of it is being swallowed by the ocean every 100 minutes. The clock is ticking, and time never waits for decisions to be made easier.